Hey yo guys, back here to give you a video on the piece that basically just aired on ESPN about Scott Hall, and I must say, first of all, I think the piece was tremendous. It was part of the E60 series, which is, some of the better stuff ESPN does. I mean, I'm not a fan of ESPN 100%, but when they put together these documentaries, whether it's the 30 for 30 series or anything of that sort, they do a fantastic job. There's no way you can deny they do a fantastic job on this. And it was really interesting to see them take a look at the realm of professional wrestling. I mean, basically the theme of tonight's episode was basically just like how much drugs mess up people with great talent. As not only was the piece on Scott Hall, but they did a pretty good piece on Dwight Gooden, former New York Met and New York Yankee pitcher. But with the Scott Hall piece, I first of all thought it was tremendous. It was well executed, very well edited. In the realm of just giving you the feel of how dark it was about a guy with so much success in his career and really personally as well, and how much it's just gone down because of drugs basically. I really like how the piece started, where you just see basically him coming to the ring at WrestleMania 10, the biggest match he ever had against Shawn Michaels, the infamous ladder match. He's coming to the ring at WrestleMania, and then they just do the cut to the event that he was in this past April, where there's 400 people. And, he's just drugged up, totally out of it. And it's just, really, really sad. The lighting on Hall throughout the whole interview is basically just dark. And, when you get to look at him, I mean, the way I think about it is, a lot of people haven't seen Scott Hall maybe since his last run in WWE in 2002, or maybe even the TNA run, basically. So if you haven't seen Scott Hall since then, it's quite a feat to be seeing how he looks lifeless, basically. And of course, the piece really started with him just saying, he's really not afraid to die. And I think once you get to that point in life, I don't know if there's any helping you. Because, what do you have to live for? And do you even want the help? I mean, people want you to be around, but are you going to be willing to receive the help? And that's the whole thing, because, he's all, well, no one's cheering my name. Trust me, if Scott Hall could get his mind on right, because Scott Hall with his mind on right is one of the most brilliant and entertaining people to not only just watch in the realm of professional wrestling, but as well just hear, talk, and probably be around. And now, if he doesn't have his head on, why would he want to be there, and why would he want to live for it? So they did that, and then they did a little bit of a backstory on him getting into wrestling. They revealed something I don't think any wrestling fan really knew about, in the fact that back before Scott Hall even was in the AWA in 1984, is that in 1983, when he was a bouncer at a nightclub in Florida, he got in a dispute with a guy and basically ended up killing him in self-defense, where he charged him, knocked him down after this gentleman had knocked the windshields and windows out of his car, and he just, basically were wrestling over a gun, and he just shot him. And, I mean, Hall put it interesting, I should have probably got help at that point. Back in 1983 is when he realized he should have got help for stuff, but he didn't know any better, and, that was just the interesting part there. They flash forward to him being on the AWA and ESPN, just how much he looked like this Greek god. And I think, while Hall was definitely one of the more better wrestlers of our time in reality, I'm talking about how they had Hogan and them talking about him in the AWA. We all know Hall wasn't ready to be the next big thing that he potentially could have been, but that was until he was in the World Wrestling Federation back in 1992 or 94, or whatever you want to say. But anyways, that probably will come later on in this video. So they went there, and I think the interesting thing here is we get the first glimpse of the family life of Scott Hall, and just he was, he was there. He was a good dad, really. I mean, I'm not saying I never thought he wasn't. Obviously, I don't know him personally, but he seemed like he was there, and just, how much, I think what any adult does when they have a kid. They call their mother up and just be like, "How could thank God for loving me?" Because like, you don't know what it's like to be doing all the baby stuff until you actually have your own kid. So that's just, I thought, something that was very, very well put and well done in that piece. And then they, of course, go to him in the WWF and basically how his life changed into the, he's the biggest star, one of the biggest stars out there, head on straight, great worker, just a guy that, people wanted to see and had his game on basically every night he was out there. And then them talking about, and they had Eric Bischoff in the piece talking about, once they moved him over at the age of 37 to WCW, he was basically the guy that helped do the boom. And I don't think he ever gets the credit he deserves. Like, sure, there's Hulk Hogan and the whole NWO as a whole, but it was Scott Hall that made people's heads turn from WWF TV to WCW television more so. And I just don't think he gets the credit he deserves in that department. And then basically it just goes, from that point on, it just becomes downhill. We see, him getting into the drugs pretty badly. And you just find out how he's just going down. And I think, while we all know the stories there and stuff, like, I think the most interesting comment throughout the piece would be X-Pac, Sean Waltman's saying just like, they've been waiting for the call for the past, like, 5 years for when he's going to die. And I think overall, like, with the piece, what I thought about it was more, like, I love professional wrestling. It's something I've grown up on, and I don't think it's always going to be a part of me, because I've grown up with it so much, and I think I've invested way too much time of my own life not to kind of throw it away. But at the end of the piece, especially when they did this stuff where they were basically just matching, basically him making big entrances throughout his career, and to like him coming out to the independent scene, kind of like what they actually did in the wrestling movie, where you get all this build up and then he comes out and there's nothing. That's what they did well in this piece too. But I mean, it's just, why be a fan? I mean, you put your faith into it, and you just feel like your superheroes are gonna die. It's not like those people who are comic book fans or superhero fans or anything like that. Like, these guys are our superheroes, and unfortunately, they're human beings. They're not immortal. They're mortals, and they're gonna pass away. And it's just, and they're gonna get messed up and do stuff that a normal human would do, and it's just hard to salvage and be a part of that. And it's just like, well, why would you want to be a part of something like that? I don't know. That's what I got. I mean, it kind of had a glimmer of hope in the story when they brought in his kid, who Scott's now training to be a wrestler, which is something positive for Scott Hall to be worrying about. In the aspect, like, it's a positive thing and keeps him going. But it's really sad to see how that relationship kind of fell apart. Is like they showed it, him and Scott and his son together, and just like that was like the third time in like 3 years he'd seen him. So like once a year you've seen your father. That's quite depressing. And then when they were talking about all his drug escapades, and they were talking about how WWE basically, if you work there in the history of the company, they'll help you in your rehab. You find out that the WWE spent the most money on the rehab of just Scott Hall. He's the most they've ever spent on it for that program. That's kind of a sad feat. Like, he's been to rehab 10 times. So, I don't know. I mean, the piece was well done. I think at the end it does give you a nice glimmer of hope of what can happen with Scott in a positive light. I thought the interviews were very well done. I think X-Pac really came out well, like especially in the part where they were talking about the incident where he had just come off of a seizure and he was just so messed up, like 2 days after, and he was all beaten up and like couldn't do anything, and it was a real sad sight to be seeing, especially for someone who was such a great worker, Scott Hall, and how messed up he was. And it was more like X-Pac finally calling out the promoter, like, so just because you advertised him doesn't mean you can't pull him off, and you just used a beaten up guy just to get some money. That was kind of sad. And I think that's something that needs to be done in the business. They need to call out promoters for doing shady acts like that more often. But definitely find a way to get a chance to see it. I was just blown away by how good it was, and at the end, you're just like heartbroken, really. Like for me, like Scott was a part of my life in reality. Like growing up, like that, I've seen that guy on my television more so than many of the prime ministers of my own country, and just seeing him kind of deteriorate in front of your eyes is it's one of the hardest things I think you have to witness. And I don't know. I mean, the guys that I'm growing up with are like starting to leave this earth, and it's just like, well, is it something worth really getting emotionally invested in as a fan anymore? I don't know. I mean, I'm still invested, but like you don't ever get to really see how that side and anymore. But other than that, that's it for me. I'm out. Peace.